All right, we're just going to get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Culture Day's first webinar of 2019. I am Megan from Metcalf, and I'm the Outreach and Programs Manager for Culture Days. Now, before we get started, I want to familiarize everyone with our webinar platform. You'll be able to see the webinar up on your screen. If you have any questions, please open the chat and type them in right there. They're going to be directed just to the panelists, so myself and Kelly. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, so I'll be able to take all of your questions and share them with Kelly so he'll be able to answer them. A recording will also be generated and posted on our website in a few days. So if you have any questions, things that you want to be sharing with your colleagues, or just want to go back and review some of the content, that's definitely something you'll be able to do shortly. Lastly, we're going to have a very brief poll at the end of the webinar just to learn a little bit more about who's tuned in today. We very much appreciate it if you could fill it out. I'm going to remind everybody once we finish off the webinar. So now, to get into today's presentation, we're very excited to be kicking off our webinar series with a talk from Hill Strategies President Kelly Hill. Hill Strategies is a Canadian arts research company. Each year, they take on interesting custom research and evaluation projects. They have experience designing and implementing surveys and interview protocols, analyzing qualitative and quantitative research information, and reporting results in a clear and accessible manner. Hill Strategies is known for marking the arts and culture benchmarks within the country and for providing Canadians with an understanding of issues and advancements within the sector. Kelly founded Hill Strategies in 2002 and has since worked on nearly 400 research projects and presentations on the arts and culture information in Canada. He brings to the table a thorough understanding of the arts landscape in the country. So today's presentation will largely be focused on Hill Strategies' Statistical Insight in the Arts series. It's funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Ontario Arts Council. We are excited to be delving into the recent reports on arts participation in Canada, especially as we near our own 10-year anniversary and look back on the many ways the arts landscape has changed over the past decade. We think that this presentation will be a great way to benchmark the state of the arts in Canada and give us a new starting point as we continue to think about the ways we can support arts engagement and participation. This presentation is also a great gateway into our annual theme for this year. Throughout 2019, Culture Days will examine the arts and culture sector through the lens of creativity, the arts, and well-being. We'll be sharing research, ideas, and stories connecting the many ways engagement with the arts and culture can influence the vitality and well-being of individuals and their communities. Kelly's talk will give us a good idea of who's participating in the arts, where we've gone, the areas we need to grow, and how we can support that healthy and vibrant community. I believe he's also going to be making a few links to some references to earlier Hill Strategies reports on arts participation and well-being as well. So that's going to be an exciting link to our final bit of the theme. So now, before I say too much, I will welcome Kelly to the webinar. And so just a reminder that there will be a Q&A period at the end, so type in all of your questions in the Zoom webinar chat. Thank you, and over to Kelly.
Thank you very much, Megan, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. If you're out in BC, I guess we're hitting the morning time, but other than that, by and large, we're going to be afternoon people. I am Kelly Hill, president of Hill Strategies, and I wanted to also thank, in addition to Culture Days, for hosting this presentation, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Department of Canadian Heritage, and the Ontario Arts Council for funding this series of presentations, as well as the Statistical Insights on the Arts series as a whole. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about Hill Strategies research, in case you don't know much about my company. I will fill you in on that. I will talk about what I mean by cultural participation, what I'm going to be talking about with the indicators of cultural participation. I am going to, as Megan mentioned, provide some links to well-being in Canadian society related to the arts and culture. And as Megan also mentioned, there's a Q&A session, so hopefully I would have some answers to whatever questions you might wish to describe in the chat box as we go along. Hill Strategies Research, I founded in 2002 to provide rigorous and reliable research on the arts and culture specifically. Our brand new website provides tons of arts research information from over that whole time frame, over the whole 16 and a half years of Hill Strategies existence. So it is, I hope, a great resource for all of you. If you haven't plumbed it yet, please do so. One of the products that we've produced since the beginning, since 2002, is the Arts Research Monitor, which provides synopses of qualitative and quantitative research in the arts and culture. These are one-page summaries of research findings from across the world with a largely Canadian focus, but not exclusively Canadian focus. That product is funded by the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts. And that information is all categorized and searchable on our website. So for example, if you want to look at something that's relevant to today's discussion, social outcomes related to the arts and culture, I've just provided a little screenshot here of a few of the recent resources, the most recent resources, including a couple of literature reviews of the social effects of culture. The Statistical Insights on the Arts series, also founded in 2002, provides an in-depth exploration of Canadian arts data. These are 25-page reports or longer. The last couple have been clocking in at around 50 pages, so they're very hefty and full reports with many tables and charts on the statistical findings, largely drawn from StatsCan data, raw data. That project is funded by the OAC, Canada Council, and Department of Canadian Heritage. A couple of recent examples of the reports that we've done in the past few months. Canadians' arts, culture, and heritage participation in 2016. I'll be talking about quite a few findings from that report today, as well as a more recent report on demographic patterns in Canadians' arts participation. And I'll provide some findings on that as well today. Presentations, such as what we're doing today, are there to communicate and distribute insightful arts research information. They're packaged along with the Statistical Insights on the Arts series. So let's get started. And I'm just going to give you a warning that I am going to turn off the visual element of the presentation, because the visual element of me doing the presentation, because I don't think seeing me is that useful at this point. I will come back in when we do the Q&A, but I will leave the screen share to do the talking, let's say. So I will leave it to the presentation itself and my vocal element to guide you through. Okay, when I'm talking about cultural participation and arts participation specifically, what am I talking about? I'm talking about, in this case, I'm talking about findings from Statistics Canada's General Social Survey from 2016, which was a telephone and online survey of 9,844 Canadians, asking them 28 questions. There we go, 28 questions related to the arts and culture. 8 questions related to people who make or perform art, and 20 questions related to arts, culture, and heritage attendance activities. From that raw data, Hill Strategies created some summary indicators of arts, culture, and heritage participation in Canada. For example, we looked at Canadians who made or performed art as a whole, not just in each of the individual 8 categories, attended arts performances or exhibitions, visited cultural heritage sites, read books, watched movies, or listened to recorded music. I'm going to run through a number of these indicators today with an emphasis on some of the earlier ones, the arts-related ones, more than the broader books or movies indicators, but they're included here as well when I'm talking about cultural participation from a wide-angle lens. From that really wide-angle lens, we see that 99.5% of Canadians participated in some type of arts, culture, or heritage activity in 2016. We've termed that virtually all Canadians, because it's not quite all, but the 0.5% of people, very few people didn't participate in culture in some way, shape, or form in 2016. We've provided some infographics related to Canadians' arts, culture, and heritage participation. Some of the key findings, I'm going to run through them a little bit more as we move along, but just to summarize some of the really key facts about arts attendance, we produced this particular infographic. So the first big indicator that I wanted to go through in a little bit more detail is arts attendance, broadly writ. That includes 8 arts activities, so 8 questions from the General Social Survey. Whether people attended a public art gallery or art museum in 2016. All of these questions relate to what people did in the given year, which was 2016. Whether people attended the live performance, We've termed that theater or comedy because that's essentially what they're talking about here, but it was phrased rather broadly as a live performance, such as drama, musical theater, dinner theater, or comedy, popular music performances, symphonic or classical music performances, artistic or cultural festivals, performances of cultural or heritage music, theater, or dance. This was a really interesting and very specific question. The cultural or heritage specific element of attendance elicited some interesting responses, and I'll touch on that really briefly today. Any other kind of cultural performance that isn't mentioned in the above list, as well as movies at a theater. We included that because that is part of arts attendance, we think. So overall, we found that 86% of Canadians attended at least one of these 8 arts activities. We certainly broke that down into a lot more detail: art gallery attendance, movie theater attendance, and then arts performances or festivals. So roughly 2/3 of Canadians attended some kind of arts performance or festival in 2016. And as you get further to the right, that breaks down arts performances or festivals even more. Roughly half of Canadians, 46%, attending live music performance in 2016, and nearly 40% attending an art gallery as well. So this particular infographic provides you with some of the details of arts attendance that we wanted to look at. Some of the questions that we had to deal with and that we rolled up into the broader indicators. An interesting element of arts participation is not just how many people attend the arts in a given year, but who attends and who doesn't attend. So we produced a second infographic, or a third infographic already that I've talked about today, with the similarities and differences in the overall arts attendance rate. So compared to the 86% of Canadians who attended the arts in 2016, on the left-hand side of this infographic, you see some of the similar attendance rates between women and men, very similar between racialized and non-racialized Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, immigrants and non-immigrants, very similar overall arts attendance rates between those different groups. On the right-hand side, you see some of the differences. One of the stunning differences from this report was that 97% of youth 15 to 24 attended an arts event in 2016, and that rate was much lower for senior 65 and over. There's also differences between large urban centers and rural and small population centers. Not as huge of a difference as is the case for youth versus seniors, but there is a pretty substantial difference in family income levels. When you look at the highest family income level that was available in the survey, $125,000 or more, versus those who earn less than $50,000 per year, much higher attendance rates overall for those with higher income levels. Also, within this finding is one that is almost a no-brainer when we're doing arts research, arts participation research, and that is that higher education leads to higher arts attendance. That was by no means a surprise to us when we found that in this survey. Looking at attendance rates, more specifically, when we look at Indigenous residents, as I mentioned earlier, there was very little overall difference between the arts attendance rate of Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians. However, when we delved down into more detail, we found that there was much higher attendance rate for Indigenous residents than non-Indigenous Canadians at the specific question that I mentioned, heritage or ethnic performances, which did specifically refer to dance, theater, or music performances such as Aboriginal peoples, Chinese, or Ukrainian. So when people saw them reflected specifically in the question, they said, yes, we attended that. Now, in theory, if they had gone to these kinds of heritage or ethnic performances, they might have been they could possibly have also included those in theater or music or other kinds of activities. But this question drew out a lot of responses from Indigenous residents specifically, much higher attendance rates overall than the non-Indigenous Canadians at that specific question. On the other hand, Indigenous residents had lower attendance rates at public art galleries, classical music performances, and cultural festivals, by and large. Those were more standard questions, the more standard wording of those questions, let's say, that did not address Aboriginal people, Chinese, or Ukrainian as examples of the kinds of heritage or ethnic performances that the StatsCan was talking about in those questions. So what we found, one of the other interesting elements that we found in the survey findings is that even for some of the groups where there were similar overall attendance rates, such as Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians, there were substantial differences in what sorts of activities people attended. So the report that I've referenced here on this slide, the demographic patterns in Canadians' arts participation, that delves into detail about a whole host of different kinds of activities. So it provides a lot of detail about, if you're most interested in theater and comedy performances question, that's there. If you're most interested in art galleries, there's a breakdown of attendance at art galleries as well. So there's a lot of detail provided in that report. That was one of the big bricks that we produced that was about 50 pages long. I said one of the key findings, one of the striking findings, is that Canadian youth are avid arts participants, excuse me. And so because that was a striking finding for us, we produced an infographic based on it. So on this infographic, you see on the left-hand side, we've got the participation rates of youth between 15 and 24 years of age, and that was our definition of youth based on this survey findings, and the Canadian averages on the right-hand side. So in terms of making or performing art, a much higher participation rate for youth 15 to 24 than the overall Canadian average. And when you go down through the different elements of arts attendance, you see that there's much higher attendance rates on the left-hand side than on the right-hand side for a whole host of different activities, including, but not just, movie theaters down at the bottom as well. Now, that being said, we're not saying that youth have higher arts attendance rates at everything, because there were a few categories of participation of arts attendance specifically that were very similar between youth and the overall Canadian average. Classical music performances, the heritage or ethnic performances question that I mentioned a moment ago, and other kinds of cultural performances not specifically specified in the questionnaire. So the second indicator that I want to look at, not in as much depth as the first indicator, but is arts attendance excluding movie theaters. We recognize we didn't want to make a big distinction between what we might call high arts and low arts attendance, but we did want to look at, so we did include movie theaters in most of the categories that we looked at. When the overall arts attendance figure, 86%, includes people who just went to a movie in the year, and that was it. So we wanted to look at arts attendance excluding movie theaters. So looking at some of the 7 other categories, we found that 73% of Canadians, so roughly 3/4 of Canadians, still, even without the movie theater category, roughly 3/4 of Canadians went to an arts performance, or sorry, an arts activity of some kind in 2016. Drilling down just a little bit more, in this indicator of arts performance or festival attendance, we simply removed from the previous slide, we removed public art galleries. So we looked at arts performances or festivals specifically, so people who go out to a performance of some kind in some way, shape, or form, and that was 68% of Canadians. So roughly 2/3 of Canadians went to some kind of arts performance or festival. And just one point, I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't stress it too much. It wasn't any kind of festival that was asked about in the question. It was specifically an artistic or cultural festival, and the examples that I give on that line here and on other slides are the examples that were actually given in the questionnaire, such as film, jazz, folk, comedy. So that's what they hinted at to people, where they told people some of the elements of what might be included in artistic or cultural festivals. One of the interesting indicators that we looked at that was available for the first time in 2016 from the StatsCan survey was making or performing art. So this includes 8 participatory activities, and I haven't provided a full breakdown of the percentage of people in this presentation. It certainly is in the full report on Canadians' arts activities. But the list here is sorted from the highest participation rate to the lowest participation rate. So crafts were actually highest of all of the participatory activities, followed by making music, visual arts, writing, dance, audiovisual or interactive media, and theater. And overall, when you combine responses to those 8 types of activities, exactly 1/2 of Canadians made or performed art in 2016. And we really thought that that was also a stunning finding of the first report that we produced in November, I believe it was. So again, it's not just how many people make or perform art, create or perform art, it's also who does and who doesn't. And for this indicator, we thought one thing we found that was really interesting in our demographic patterns report is that there was really similar participation rates in making or performing art by family income and between rural and urban residents. And those 2 elements, those 2 findings set the analysis of making and performing art apart from arts attendance rates. So when we're looking at arts attendance, obviously access to the opportunities to participate are lower in rural areas. There aren't as many theaters, there aren't as many dance performances, there just aren't as many possibilities for you. So the overall attendance rates, not too surprisingly, are lower. But when we look at something that has, let's say, a lower barrier to entry, you don't have to have an art gallery to make or perform art, we found that there was a very similar participation rate. I'm going to give you just a really sneak peek at some provincial and local data from an upcoming report scheduled to be published on March 27th. So in 3 weeks from today, we'll be producing a report on provincial and local arts and culture participation rates. It'll basically go through everything that we did in the national report, but on provincial level, on the provincial level, and on the local level, there's some key indicators that we were able to obtain from StatsCan. So I'm just going to give you a really small taste of that today, and we're still in the making or performing art category. When you look across the provinces, this is sorted from west to east with the national average at the far left. We see that in the furthest easternmost provinces in Canada, they have the highest rates of making or performing art, specifically on Prince Edward Island and in Nova Scotia. We were also able to obtain data on the 9 largest census metropolitan areas in Canada. And this is again sorted from west to east, although the furthest eastern point is Quebec City. When we look at this, there's pretty similar to the national average, by and large across the board, slightly higher in Ottawa-Gatineau than anywhere else in the country, but certainly lower in Montreal and Quebec City in terms of participation, active participation in making or performing arts activities. I'm just going to run through really quickly a few of the other indicators from the report on Canadians' arts, culture, and heritage participation. The book reading indicator, 77% of Canadians read a book in 2016. Heritage attendance, which included 4 cultural heritage activities, specifically not natural heritage activities. That's why we tossed the word cultural heritage activities in there. We included art galleries here as well. We included other kinds of museums. We included historic sites. And we included my favorite category, which is an incredibly long one to try to produce on a graph: zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, planetariums, or observatories. So in that indicator, 7 out of 10 Canadians attended some kind of heritage activity in 2016. Breaking that down into the component parts, 39% visited an art gallery, 35% visited a museum, 1/2 of Canadians went to an historic site in 2016, and 46% went to a zoo, aquarium, botanical garden, planetarium, or observatory. Mentioned that 48% of Canadians went to a museum of some kind, either a public art gallery or a different kind of museum. I'm going to turn my attention now to some trends over time. What we did find in the trends over time analysis is that there were similar surveys that were conducted by StatsCan periodically since 1992. So we were able to produce some trends information. And that trends information was largely positive, as evidenced by a strong increase in the art gallery attendance rate in that period, a strong increase in attendance at historic sites during that period, and also increases in areas such as movie theaters, museums, other than art galleries, and other kinds of heritage activities. That super long category that I don't want to go over in full once again. There were quite a few positive results, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. It's all right. After I mentioned that there was a decrease, to no one's surprise, in people listening to music on CDs or other conventional formats over time. The art gallery attendance rate has grown pretty significantly since 1992, when the survey, similar question, was first asked. 20% of Canadians went to an art gallery in 1992, 24% in 1998, 27% in 2005, and that jumped to the high 30s in 2010 and 2016. Festival attendance also went up, but not quite as distinct a pattern, let's say. The highest attendance rate was actually in 2010, but still the 2016 rate is higher than the earlier rates when the question was asked in 1998 and 2005. And I don't know that I mentioned this specifically at the beginning, but all of these statistics relate to someone who did something at least once. And it could be only once, it could be multiple times. And we have limited information about the frequency of attendance in the survey. There is some information, but in rolling that up, it would be incredibly challenging to roll that up into the overall indicators as well, and to look at frequency across 28 different questions, when the frequency questions are asked differently in, asked, let's say, 6 to 8 different ways in those questions. So, and largely for good reason. The different kinds of activities, sometimes the frequency, likely frequencies would be different. So what we're dealing with here is not overall attendance numbers at art galleries, or in this slide, festivals. We're looking at the percentage of Canadians who went at least once during the year. The analysis of trends is very limited because there has been many changes in the general social survey questions. The performing arts questions have changed significantly over time and even recently. So that precludes an analysis of trends in performing arts attendance, for example. But it's also related to the changing nature of arts participation. The questions do change. The nature of arts participation changes, so the questions have to change to reflect that. And we see that in some of the questions about how people listen to music. There was, in more recent surveys, there was digital music became a more important factor, obviously, and a new factor related to 1992, for example. So that is there was a need, obviously, to add some questions on that in that regard. The making of performing art questions, the 8 questions I mentioned in that category, within that indicator, they were newly added in 2016, so we do not have any sort of trends analysis for that indicator over time. All right, I'm going to return my last number of slides to talk about arts and well-being. And some have even thought that art could be considered medicine sometimes, and I'm going to reference the Culture Days blog in this regard from about a month ago, when art is the best medicine. And a quote from that is, with artists sketching at hospital bedsides and doctors writing prescriptions for museum visits, links are growing between arts and medicine sectors in Canada. So there is quite a bit of research, there is quite a bit of identification of the possibilities of the arts in being a type of medicine for some things, let's say. Certainly related to well-being, related to health. The arts are related to health, the arts are related to well-being. I think that's the main point here. Whether it's a medicine, it's not a cure-all for everything, obviously, but it is possibly a tool that could be used to improve the well-being of Canadians. You could find out a lot more information about the health outcomes of the arts and related to the arts and culture if you go through Hill Strategy's website and end up in the Arts Research Monitor section. I did a filter by health outcomes category, and the most recent issue of the Arts Research Monitor dealt with that really specifically, related to live music and care, how music matters in complex care and rehabilitation settings, and the Arts for Health and Wellbeing, a really interesting review article from the UK on the arts and health and well-being. As I mentioned earlier, there's also tons of resources related to other related topics, such as social outcomes of the arts and the economic impact of the arts. Oops. I want to spend a little bit of time looking back to a report that I did in 2013 based on 2010 statistics that linked cultural attendance and well-being in Canada very specifically. And it is on the table to reproduce some type of similar report in the next 18 months, let's say. This is a discussion that I'm going to have with the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Department of Canadian Heritage in about a month or so, and setting the agenda for exactly what the future reports will be. But in our proposal to do this, to continue the stats insights on the arts reports, we did talk about doing a report on arts and well-being. So the older report from 2013 related to 2010 statistics from the General Social Survey as well. What we did is we compared cultural attendees and non-attendees. So in terms of the cultural activities, it's people who did something 0 times versus people who did something at least once. And on the indicator side of health and well-being, we looked at the averages for somebody who did something 0 times and the averages for somebody who did something at least once. For example, the average health level. We looked at the 18 arts, culture, and heritage activities that were available to us in that survey, from museum and gallery attendance, performing arts and festivals, heritage attendance, reading, film, audio, video participation, and we tried to correlate those with 8 indicators of health, well-being, and social connectedness. So self-reported health, self-reported mental health, did people volunteer or did they not, did people feel trapped in a daily routine, what their individual level of stress was, their knowledge of their neighbors, whether they did a favor for their neighbors, and their self-reported satisfaction with life. So what the General Social Survey, as you might guess from its name, has some general societal questions in it that are asked at different points. They're not asked every time, but in 2010, there were these questions of health and well-being that were asked on the same survey as we had the cultural activities. So we decided to try to cross-tabulate the two and see what we found. So for example, when we look at theater attendees, the 12.4 million Canadians 15 or older in 2010 who attended the theater had significantly better results on 7 of 8 well-being indicators compared to those who attended 0 theater performances during the year. And just to look at what that looks like in a chart, just from left to right, the left-hand side, the deeper pink is people who attended the theater. The lighter pink is people who did not attend the theater, and you can see that there's a difference, and it's a significant difference for a lot of them. The only non-difference area where it's the same is in stress levels. So we looked at that, as I mentioned, we looked at the 8 social indicators and the 18 cultural activities. Multiply those together, we get 144 potential connections between cultural activities and social well-being. And we found that cultural attendees have significantly better results than non-attendees for 101 of the 144 social connections. So that was a very strong finding that 70%, in 70% of the cases, cultural attendees had significantly better results than non-attendees related to well-being. Now we know that that type of analysis just scratches the surface on what could be done and on trying to provide proofs of the evidence of the connection between the arts and well-being. So we dove more thoroughly into a statistical analysis involving correlations between a smaller number of cultural activities, the 6 cultural activities you see on the left-hand side here, and 3 indicators of health and well-being on the right-hand side. So we looked at health, we looked at very strong satisfaction with life, and we looked at people who volunteered in the past year. And we did a correlation that controlled for a whole host of other socioeconomic characteristics: education, income, age, sex, children at home or not, language, region of the country, urban or rural residents, whether someone self-identified as Aboriginal, as a visible minority, as an immigrant, and people who did physical activity in the past week. So we controlled for those other characteristics. And we found, for example, still keeping the example of theater attendees, we found that theater attendees were 32% more likely to report very good or excellent health than non-attendees, even once we eliminated the potential impact of the whole host of other factors that we mentioned on the previous page. So the confidence interval just gives you kind of the range of confidence for that, that type of statistic. So between the theater attendees are between 18 and 48% more likely to report very good or excellent health than non-attendees is the official way to report that kind of statistic. The average, let's say, is 32% more likely. Second indicator, very strong satisfaction with life. Theater attendees are 30% more likely to have very strong satisfaction with life. And theater attendees are 89% more likely than non-attendees to volunteer. And in this case, it's volunteering at any kind of not-for-profit organization. It's not just volunteering in the arts and culture specifically. So they're engaged in their communities in that way. So when we look at the 6 cultural activities on the left and the 3 indicators of well-being and social connectedness on the top, and we do a kind of a summary. This is a summary chart of all the activities with all of the potential health and social outcomes. We found that in 16 of the 18 cases, there was a statistically significant correlation between arts attendance, cultural participation, and the indicators of social well-being. So we think that overall, in addition to the 70% indicator I mentioned earlier, there's a difference. We delved even more deeply into that, the nature of that difference, and found that even once we control for a bunch of other factors that might have an impact on people's health, people's satisfaction with life, and people's propensity to volunteer, even once we did that, arts and culture still stood out as having a correlation with the outcomes from a social well-being perspective. Now, there are limitations to this. By no means is this the be-all and end-all of this kind of research, but it is a very interesting take on and a very specific connection between Canadians' arts participation and the indicators of well-being. Some of the limitations, we know that that someone who did an activity once versus somebody who did an activity 0 times in a year, it's a pretty low threshold. It's not necessarily enough to have a huge social impact, but it was a clean and simple demarcation point that we were able to use between, let's say, theater attendees and non-attendees. And we still, even with that low threshold, we found a very significant difference. There are international studies that have looked at the frequency of participation and shown that repeated cultural experiences might generate stronger social connections, stronger health outcomes. We were not able to do that in our study. There are some other factors that might have an impact on, say, health that were not asked about in the general social survey. For example, smoking and alcohol consumption are 2 big examples. We also know that it's pose the question of, does cultural participation always foster or strengthen social ties? Likely not, but we did find a strong connection between the 2, but that connection could, in theory, go in either way. People could have a higher quality of life because they participate in the arts, which is the way that we were kind of thinking about the stats that I've talked about earlier. But those with higher quality of life might tend to participate more in the arts as well. So they might already have a higher quality of life, higher health outcomes. So it might not be, the connection might not go just in one direction. It might be mutually reinforcing. Social inequality could have an impact here. We did look at income levels as well, but social inequality in general could lead to different rates of arts participation. which could reinforce the health disparities overall in the population. I'm going to close with a few other examples of some of the impacts of the arts from a really recent, in fact, it was just published, how many weeks ago? A couple weeks ago, I think it was. It was in the past month for sure, in February 2019, a report and survey that I did for Capicoa on the vitality, and impact of arts presenting in Canada. So in that project, we had arts presenters talk to us about, in a survey format, about the impacts of arts presenting, and we got some really interesting feedback from them. For example, it was an opportunity, the arts presentation that took place, one example specifically from King's Theatre in Nova Scotia was that an arts presentation really opened eyes to Indigenous people's stories. The community reaction was very strong. It was an extraordinary experience, and they were able to learn more about Indigenous people's stories and to view things from an Indigenous point of view, which is also important in the context of reconciliation. Another example from the same survey is a workshop with youth at risk that developed songs that had everyone who participated in tears, and that kind of strong emotional impact and that kind of strong attachment to the arts and culture can also have a really important connection to people's well-being. So that's all I have from my content, and I'm going to try to put myself back on screen. I also muted myself accidentally, excuse me, and say thank you for spending the time today, and we will see if we have some questions that I can try to answer.
All right, thank you very much, Kelly, to start. That was a great presentation, and I think it was a great way to start off our 2019 webinar series, but also make those ties into looking back on arts participation and thinking a little bit about the ways that arts and culture can affect community well-being. We have had a few questions that have come in. One of them was about dance specifically. People were, we were looking at different categories of arts participation, and the person was wondering if dance, such as like ballet, contemporary, etc., was included in live performance or other cultural events.
Yeah, very good question. I hate the way that StatsCan asks about dance, or more specifically, doesn't ask about dance. So I believe technically it would be included in other cultural performances not mentioned elsewhere in the survey, because they don't mention dance specifically. Now, the nature of the other question on live performance, the examples related to theater, but if you went to a dance performance, you might think that that was also included there. So it's not, I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but by and large, I believe that people who went to dance or people who went to opera would be two of the bigger categories that StatsCan doesn't ask about specifically, that would be included in other types of performances. So that's, by and large, that's where I believe it would be. And I certainly wish that I had a more specific dance question that I could have done a breakdown for you on, because I certainly would have included that, being a dance fan myself. But I'm afraid I don't have that.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you. That, yes, it would be nice to know which category that fell in. Someone else was wondering how often you do these surveys. If it's if they're specific, like if there's a calendar where you do them regularly. It looked like it was about every 5 years. Okay.
There's a couple of elements to that question that I need to answer. A, we don't do the surveys ourselves at Hill Strategies. These are StatsCan surveys. So the StatsCan does them, the short answer to that is when they can, roughly every 5 years. The longer answer to that is when they have funding to do it, when the opportunity arises, and so it is not on a regular schedule in that sense. It's been anywhere, I think 5, 6, 8 year periods have gone in between the cultural activities segment of the general social survey being on the questionnaire. And looking to the future, StatsCan is looking at redesigning the general social survey in general and not just specifically the cultural activities questions. So I'm anticipating more changes before we get around to another iteration of this survey. So there are challenges at many levels here, and I am not in control of the questions that are asked, and I am not in control of the schedule on which they are asked. But those are both in StatsCan's bailiwick, and it is not as regular as I would like it either. I would love it if it was, well, honestly, I'd love it if it was every year, if it was an ongoing thing where we got feedback on this on a more regular basis, but that's not likely to happen unless we look at collecting the stats completely differently. And so that's not going to happen, but it would be lovely if it was every 5 years, and that was a pretty firm date, and we had data every 5 years. But that I'm not going to hold my breath on that one either.
Okay. Another comment / question is that it would have been great to know what motivated people to participate, either as a maker or an attendee. Is it possible that volunteerism was up because people were volunteering at the event as a way to save money, or maybe not to be able to attend but not have to pay the entrance fee?
Okay, so I'll take the second half of that first, the volunteer aspect. In theory, yes. If people volunteered at an arts event and they got a free ticket to that arts event, let's say, they would be both an attendee and a volunteer in that year. But I think given the large-scale nature of the surveys, roughly 10,000 people responding, I don't think that's going to be the case for the majority of respondents. So it's going to be the case for some of them, but it's not going to be the case for everybody. So by and large, we're looking at connections between volunteering in general and arts attendance in the specific ways that I talked about arts attendance. And Megan, if I could get you to repeat the first half of that question.
Oh, yes. The first one was saying it would have been nice to know what motivated people to participate, either as a speaker or attendee, which, I mean, may not have likely didn't come up in the survey. Are there other studies that you've done that have shed some light on that?
Yes, there are some other studies that talk about motivation. I 100% agree with you that if I had questions to add to this survey, the top priority would be, in addition to some about dance and opera specifically related to culture, it would be about motivations for and/or barriers against participating in culture, and what motivated people and what did not motivate people. And that in itself is a stream of research that is very important for cultural researchers. There have been some findings in that regard. I think the Canadian Heritage Arts Access and Availability Survey talks a little bit about motivations, but doesn't really delve into it. There are some findings in that area, but nothing incredibly recent in Canada that I can recall off the top of my head, other than possibly the Canadian Heritage Survey of Arts Access and Availability. But that didn't have a huge number of questions on motivation, as I recall. So that is a gap in this survey, and one that we're not able to close. And if we had motivation questions, my presentation today would have been very different. It would have talked about what's the number one motivation, what's the number two motivation, what's the different motivations for different kinds of activities, what's the different motivations for different kinds of people. We could have done such a richer analysis. So thank you for making me cry, and that we don't have those data.
Another question starts off with saying, awesome information. Is there a significant contrast or connection between language and arts participation? Followed by, do you think intangible heritage is a new trend for museums to pay more attention to?
Okay.
Another two-parter.
Another two-parter. The intangible heritage, I'd say a rather bland yes to your question. I'm not a heritage expert by any means. I'm more of an arts expert. So I would not want to second guess what museums do in that regard. But yes, intangible heritage, I think, is incredibly important in society in general, and it's something that the survey doesn't actually get at particularly well either. The kind of stories that shape our people, ourselves, our identities, and the connection to identity would be really interesting there, as either a motivation or an impact of arts attendance. So yes, I think that's important in a general sense, but I'm not going to try to tell museums to do more of it or less of it, because that's not something I have enough information on to really weigh in on. Now, the first part of the question, sorry again, Megan?
The first part of the question was about if there are any connections between language and arts participation.
Yes, language was one of the demographic factors that we looked at in the demographic patterns report. And we didn't, if I remember the findings specifically, we didn't find a huge number of differences by language. There were some rather fine-grained differences, I would say, but by and large, there were not huge overall disparities in arts participation for speakers of different languages. And we were able to look at Anglophones, Francophones, and speakers of non-official languages as well in the survey. So we were able to look at the three different categories of language.
Okay. Last question here that I think we have time for is another dance question. Is someone who is curious about whether you were taking creative arts therapy into account when talking about well-being. So are you largely focusing on like general societal well-being and participation, or is there a portion that's really focusing on arts therapy, or is that possibly in another survey as well, or another study?
Right. Arts therapy is not in this survey, so it was not in my presentation today. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in that aspect, and I agree with you that there is tons of research available on creative arts therapies, and I think that's a really interesting avenue for us to pursue as a society, let's say. So I think that's incredibly interesting and important, but it is not something that I talked about today because it is not something that I have specific data and questions on.
Yes, thank you. All right, so I think those are all the questions we have time for. Thank you very much to everybody for sending them in. And once again, thank you, Kelly, for leading this great talk. Again, it was a nice way to kick off the first of our webinar series. So for those of you who are interested in any upcoming webinars, as well as our blogs and other information about the Culture Days weekend, I definitely recommend you sign up for our newsletter, and you can follow us on social media as well. That's where you're going to get all the really important information. If you are interested in that topic of well-being, we've also recently launched a blog series. Kelly very briefly mentioned it in his presentation, but you can head over to our blog. The first one was written by Canadian Art Magazine editor Leah Sandals, and there's going to be another post coming up very soon. So that's a great way to read a little bit more about this topic of well-being and some of the links to communities and that wellness. That is about everything for now. I am going to be launching this poll and would very much appreciate if you take the time to fill it out. It is 3 questions and they're multiple choice, so I promise it's going to be very quick. But thank you for joining us today. We will be showing a recording of this up on our website, so you're able to see anything that you may have missed or share this with any colleagues who weren't able to join us today. All right, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, everyone.